Granas Gomitinoao, Masi Kakiao, Niwako Makinak. So my name is Zoe. I am a Métis scholar. I'm incredibly grateful to join you here tonight. I am here on unceded Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh territories, but I live most of the time in Sunaymuxw, Snanaas, and Qualicum territories, just north of Nanaimo, and I'm really thankful to be able to split my time between both of these really powerful territories in my work as a Métis person. So thank you so much for inviting me into your community this week to share some of the work that my colleagues are doing with our transdisciplinary research creation scholarship, which incorporates social science, fine arts, science, and knowledge mobilization within our experimental project titled the Institute for Freshwater Fish Futures. And I'm just going to share my screen so that you can see the slides that I've prepared for you. I'm a very visual learner, so that's sort of how I share information. So here we go. So I'm going to talk about critical freshwater fish futures using interdisciplinary and arts-based research approaches to engage relationships between Indigenous sovereignty and freshwater fish well-being. And as of yesterday, I am now an associate professor at Simon Fraser University in Indigenous Studies, and I'm beyond excited to be working here now and to be in a place that just has so many brilliant Indigenous scholars and scholars who are doing community engaged and very accountable research. It really is a dream come true for me. So I'm so excited to share tonight how I am mobilizing the incredible work of fellow colleagues in critical Indigenous studies to adopt and adapt two approaches that we're sort of playfully calling critical Indigenous fish philosophy and critical Indigenous fish futures, which I and my colleagues and friends employ to examine and elucidate the relationships between First Nations, Inuit, and Métis sovereignty in Canada and freshwater fish well-being, autonomy, and survivance here and elsewhere. It's especially heartening to see the effort that UBC is putting into hiring and supporting Indigenous scientists throughout the Faculty of Science at UBC. It is setting an important precedent for the celebration of Indigenous STEM research in the country, and it's really inspiring to witness. I want to especially thank the Larkin Lecture Organizing Committee for organizing this event, and I want to extend a particular thank you to Catherine Kame for all of your support in organizing things and for being so exquisitely flexible and supportive when we had to pivot yesterday when I came down with a mystery virus that is still here. My brain is not as clear as I would like it to be tonight, but I really wanted to make sure I could join you. And I'm also so thankful that I can join you tonight, even though I can't be here in person. And I hope that now that I'm here more permanently, I will have the privilege to meet some of you in person in coming weeks, months, and years. And it's just really exciting. So the work I'm going to share with you today is deeply grounded in my relationships to family, to place, and to the intellectual communities I'm so fortunate to be a part of. It is especially meaningful to be giving the Larkin Lecture here in 2022 because I was raised and mentored by someone very dear to me who was himself immersed in the world of freshwater fish biology and species protection in Alberta. My late stepfather, Wayne Emerson Roberts, was a curator at the Museum of Zoology at the University of Alberta for several decades, and he was a former student and later colleague of the late ichthyologist, Dr. Joseph Nelson. I grew up in the 90s running around and immersed in the world of biology at the University of Alberta, much like probably a lot of your kids are today. And I've been surrounded by biologists, naturalists, and others working towards environmental protection in Alberta for almost my entire life. So it's especially touching as an interdisciplinary artist and philosopher to get to join such an esteemed fisheries and biology community here today and to speak in a lecture series named for the esteemed scholar, Peter Larkin. Wayne did a lot of what I think of as renegade biology. After completing his Master's of Science at the University of Alberta in 1975, where he studied the behaviors of coho salmon, introduced coho salmon in Cold Lake in northeastern Alberta. And he then started a PhD with Dr. Joe Nelson, but he ultimately never finished it. And what I learned from Wayne is that you do not have to be a full-time academic to be passionately curious about the world around you or to advance questions about species well-being and futures. So these are just some pictures of Wayne fly fishing in the eastern slopes. This is him teaching my little sister and I how to fly fish when we were very little on a camping trip in Bighorn Country, which is Stoney Nakoda territory in the eastern slopes of the Alberta Rocky Mountains. Wayne worked tirelessly to document the social and scientific dimensions of various species declines in Alberta, including Salvelinus consulentus, bull trout, which you're going to hear a lot about tonight because I'm a little bit obsessed with them, the northern leopard frog, western toad, and several species of sculpins. And I would be remiss to leave out his fascination with sticklebacks and many other species that he studied and advocated for. Wayne introduced me to the vibrant and very active naturalist community in Alberta that was and is at the forefront of challenging environmental destruction, impacting both terrestrial and aquatic species at risk in the province. The critical Indigenous fish philosophy and critical Indigenous fish futures work that I do is also deeply intergenerational and expands beyond my own personal relationship with Wayne as a family member to his own family's history here on the coast in British Columbia. So Wayne's uncle was himself a fisheries biologist and completed his MSc here at UBC on the life history and distribution of lampreys in the salmon and certain other rivers in British Columbia, Canada in 1963 under the supervision of Peter Larkin. Some of you may have even worked with Wayne's uncle. The late Ferdinand Tony Fletcher spent many years working on salmon issues in BC, and there is a memorial scholarship at Langara College in honor of Tony and his late wife, Betty. And over the years, I've been connecting with other people whose parents or uncles or family members were fisheries biologists. And I think there's a really powerful and exciting community of people who got to see these geniuses at work in various institutions across the country. And they always have amazing stories about what it was like to see their parents at work, working hard to protect fish across the country. So I'm really just excited to be here as part of this particular lecture series. So the critical Indigenous fish philosophy and Indigenous fish futures work that my team and I do is also deeply informed by my relations as a Red River Métis person with both Indigenous and settler ancestors. So my dad's family, the Todds, are connected to Métis communities and families in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. My dad's paternal grandfather, James Todd, who's on the upper right-hand corner, and his grandmother, Caroline Laframboise, lived in Alberta in the early 20th century. My late grandfather, George Todd, was born in St. Paul, Alberta in 1912, and my great-great-grandfather, William Todd III, lived at Fort Pitt in Saskatchewan, which is a very important place for Métis in terms of our sort of political history. So my mom's family are British and Norwegian settlers who moved to Canada in the late 19th century. And all of these relationships really inform the work that I do. As a Métis person living in British Columbia, I also take very seriously the history that Métis have in this province, not all of it positive. So I've taken a lot of really powerful insight from Doug White III, who is a Snuneymuxw political leader, and he's reminded me that on Vancouver Island, Métis have a history. Some Métis were actually involved in the first police force on Vancouver Island as the Voltigeurs, and were known and remembered for actively hunting down Coast Salish men on behalf of James Douglas. So as a Métis person, I also take very seriously that when I am outside of my homeland, I have very particular responsibilities to the sovereignty of the First Nations, Inuit, or other Indigenous peoples whose lands I occupy when I'm working in Canada or elsewhere. So you might be wondering what all of this has to do with my promised talk on fish, sovereignty, and art. And truth be told, relationships are the basis of everything that my colleagues and I are doing, and it informs all of our projects. So the projects I'm so lucky to work on all grow out of the relationships between people, fish, and the stories that shape us. So I'm going to sort of skip ahead. This is sort of an area that is really meaningful to me, and it's where a significant number of my ongoing projects and theoretical work are grounded. and it's the waterways of the Lake Winnipeg watershed. My dear friend Darren O'Toole, who's a Métis legal scholar at the University of Ottawa, pointed out this map as soon as it was published by Canadian Geographic a number of years ago, and he said, "Look at this! Isn't that interesting? It maps almost perfectly onto the Red River Métis homeland." Although, to be very careful, we're not claiming Blackfoot territory in southern Alberta. That's not our territory at all. But we did have political relationships with First Nations, including Cree and Anishinaabe peoples in Saskatchewan and Manitoba, and we had treaties that governed those relationships. And this is the area that I'm really interested in, because as Métis, we've often been conceptualized as bison hunters, but a lot of Métis oral history and archival work really clearly demonstrates that we also were very active in fishing. And Brenda McDougall is a Métis historian who's done a lot of work to sort of look at the history of fishing in Isle La Crosse, or Sakitawak, which is a Métis community in northern Saskatchewan. Of course, we do have history in adjoining watersheds to this map, but really when you think about the history of Métis people, Métis scholar Chris Anderson says to think of the Red River Métis homeland as sort of like a heart, and the rivers that sort of pushed us out to other Métis communities as sort of the veins that carried us out. And there was always a sort of continual heartbeat bringing us back into communities, and rivers played a really significant part in that. So that's driven a lot of my interest. The work that I do today is deeply informed by relationships that my own family has to place. This is my dad, Métis artist Zoe Todd, and me. I think I'm 11 in this picture, and we're standing on the banks of the North Saskatchewan River, which in its very early stages, as it's leaving the Rocky Mountains into the foothills in the eastern slopes of Alberta. And this is where I'm really lucky to work with an amazing team of people, where we're currently looking at the impacts of different environmental, cultural, social factors in shaping the lives and realities of bull trout, and also supporting work that community members are doing on other Indigenous trout species in this area. And this work is really deeply informed by personal attachment and interest in the well-being of the waterways here, and also broader political responsibilities that Métis people have to be good guests in other people's territories. So the work that we do really centers on Indigenous sovereignty, research creation, which is really kind of a fancy way of saying that we make art, but we use it very pointedly to try and answer questions about the well-being of fish and the application of Indigenous governance to protect fish. We're really grounded in social science research. A lot of us are social scientists by training, but also have scientific backgrounds. I personally am very passionate about the history of science, and I'm really keen to try and document the history of a lot of the sort of fisheries science that has happened across freshwater fish habitats across the prairies. And so part of the work that we're doing today is interviewing scientists, both contemporary scientists, but also retired scientists, because we really want to document that kind of fine-grained history of what did people do, what are people doing to try and protect fish, and then think about how we can help that kind of conversation come into an even more fulsome conversation with Indigenous sovereignty, and something that we also are very excited about doing and is really core to a lot of our work is knowledge mobilization. So we're not hard scientists, but we work with hard scientists who we absolutely are grateful to work with, and we really do truly try to apply collaborative approaches, because to us that is really key to creatively disrupting the things that are hurting fish today. So I want to just kind of jump into a conversation about freshwater fish well-being and Indigenous sovereignty and give you some examples. And so I'm going to go back to reading my actual text because I did write some things down, but I just want to make sure that I say this in a way that's, not rambling with my fever that is currently ravaging my brain. So many Indigenous legal orders and cosmologies around the world recognize fish, other animals, lands, waters, and ecosystems as more than human persons or beings who are sentient, thinking, and operate autonomously from humans. And by this, we mean that fish are not just unthinking animals without inner worlds, as Western science has long viewed them, but rather that fish live in their own worlds and story them through their own forms of consciousness, agency, and creative engagements with dynamic and shifting environmental conditions. Curiosity about the perception and consciousness of fish is a burgeoning field of inquiry in popular culture. And I'm currently reading Ed Yong's recent book, An Immense World, and it's just so exciting to see this conversation about, sort of the perception and consciousness of animals really growing as an area that people are really excited about. And it's something that aligns really well with Indigenous approaches to understanding fish, because to many, many Indigenous societies in Canada and internationally, fish are already seen as relatives, as kin, as beings with their own agency. So historical Western scientific and colonial management approaches that treated animals and plants as inert or non-sentient beings fostered perceptions that colonial peoples who were once categorized as non-human or not fully human by racist Euro-Western societies. And this had a really massive impact on the ability of communities to continue to enact their laws, their protocols, and sovereignty. And our work really argues that the key to protecting fish is uplifting, acknowledging, and fully working with Indigenous sovereignty across different spaces today. So the colonial conservation ethics that were popular in years past were built on traditions of white supremacy, imperialism, capitalism, and control, and they actively coincided in many places with efforts to eliminate Indigenous people entirely from lands. And this happened in Canada, the USA, Australia, New Zealand, and elsewhere. We now understand that this Western domination approach to conservation and wildlife governance that excludes Indigenous peoples, ignores Indigenous sovereignty, and downplays Indigenous governance in Canada since colonization have failed to prevent wide-scale environmental crises across the country, such as the commercial overfishing of freshwater species in Lake Winnipeg, Lake Athabasca, and Great Slave Lake in the early to mid-20th century, failures to protect Atlantic cod, failures to control large-scale wildfires across the continent, failures to by government regulatory bodies to protect salmon and other commercial species in Western waterways, which a number of very important scholars in your community are working on. And in Alberta, what has been really notable is the impact that these failures have had on Indigenous trout species, and that's one of the areas that we work on directly. So wildlife conservation and land management in Canada is also connected to histories of depriving Indigenous peoples of food and sustenance in order to break our communities into compliant colonial subjects. Further, despite introduction of federal species at risk legislation in 2002, aquatic species decline continues in many parts of Canada, including troubling declines of freshwater fish species such as Athabasca rainbow trout, West Slope cutthroat trout, and bull trout in Alberta's eastern slopes. Crucially, the assertion of Western science and colonial law as the sole or authoritative mode through which to govern species recovery is contested by decolonial scholars in many territories in Canada and internationally. And some of you are in the room right now, and I'm just so thrilled that you're here. So our critical Indigenous fish philosophy work addresses these tensions between colonial laws and worldviews and Indigenous worldviews by studying how Indigenous governance can complement, challenge, and shift underlying assumptions that guide current fish species at risk legislation and broader environmental policy in Canada. And what we're learning through our community-driven work is that from working with Indigenous knowledge keepers and watersheds across many, many places, is that when Indigenous peoples and communities are supported to be strong, autonomous, and sovereign, fish well-being is also supported, and vice versa. When communities have the capacity to govern according to their own laws, fish flourish, and when fish are autonomous and respected, all of their other relations flourish as well. So Indigenous leaders nationally and internationally are calling again and again for truly decolonizing work that challenges colonial assumptions asserted by governments, corporations, and sometimes even environmental NGOs in current fish conservation models. There's a great need for platforms, programs, and approaches that truly support Indigenous communities to tell our own stories about fish, about watersheds, and Indigenous governance in our own words and on our own terms. And one of the ways that we're exploring this is through experimental and immersive art installations and investigations and community-driven approaches that really focus on immersing people within landscapes with care and respect, and invites non-Indigenous parties into those conversations in a way that really sort of foundationally says, you have to understand that when we're talking about Indigenous science or Indigenous knowledge, we're also talking about law and protocols and sovereignty. And those are sort of still not fully answered questions in how Canada came to be as a state. Canada's sovereignty itself is contested. And there are a number of commentaries coming out of Canadian courts by judges today, they're slowly starting to admit, like, if Canada asserted itself through the doctrine of discovery, maybe that makes our sovereignty not all that valid. And Indigenous folks are saying, yeah, we've been saying that for hundreds of years. Your law is actually, being asserted in very problematic ways here. So what we're trying to kind of do in our work, and what I've noticed in my own ongoing work studying scientific approaches as an ethnographer, as an anthropologist over several decades now, one thing I'm really noticing is that even in a really earnest, and it is a real, and I really believe it's earnest, and that people really are trying. There's an earnest desire for reconciliation to start shaping conservation approaches, and I really think that is coming from a meaningful place. But it's really clear in a lot of those boardrooms and other spaces that there's still a gap for a lot of settler colonial actors to really understand what we mean when we say Indigenous sovereignty or Indigenous law have to guide these processes. And this is where our work is trying to bring non-Indigenous parties, including policymakers, industry representatives, scientists, and others into conversations with the trailblazing work of critical Indigenous studies scholars who have long focused on questions of power, sovereignty, and international solidarity between Indigenous peoples here in Canada and other displaced, dispossessed, and diasporic peoples also impacted by colliding genocides of colonial theft of lands, labor, and resources across continents in the last 600 years. Aileen Morton-Robinson reminds us that critical Indigenous studies as a distinct discipline rooted in critical inquiry of colonial power and Indigenous sovereignties, quote, disrupts the certainty of disciplinary knowledges produced in the 20th century when the study of Indigenous peoples was largely the knowledge and power domain of non-Indigenous scholars, end quote. And I think one of the most powerful things that has happened in the last few decades, for sure, is that Indigenous scholars are ourselves governing our own disciplines and telling our own stories on our own terms. So while it's absolutely heartening to see a turn in recent years by scientists and government representatives towards a desire to better understand Indigenous viewpoints and knowledge with respect to environmental governance, we must also listen to world-renowned critical Indigenous studies scholars who warn us about the pitfalls of attempting to remedy historical injustices of Indigenous land theft and erasure in environmental policy through what Glenn Coltard and Elizabeth Pavanelli both call the politics of recognition, which is to say we have to be careful about settler colonial approaches to addressing environmental declines, which are caused, in my opinion, by white supremacy, colonialism, and capitalism together. And we have to be very careful that we're not trying to just address those by merely including Indigenous peoples in the settler colonial order of the world, but that we're actually following that guidance from decolonial scholars around the world who tell us we have to actually dismantle the structures that are hurting us and hurting the planet. So some of the basic issues that we confront when we're trying to have discussions across these different disciplinary spaces or different, Indigenous and non-Indigenous spaces is it comes down to definition and languages in a lot of cases. And I think some of the basic sort of challenges that we're trying to address can be helped by looking to what critical Indigenous studies has to say about how to remedy this. So we need to be able to define settler colonialism, decolonization, reconciliation, and sovereignty in clear ways that really help us unpack what is happening on a structural level that continues to impact the ability of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities to protect fish and waters through our own laws, our own protocols and approaches that are grounded in very, very, long and thoughtful legal, ethical approaches that are, really, really need to be respected more fully by the government. So I want to turn to the work of, I've already mentioned him, but Yellowknives Dene scholar Glenn Coltard, who teaches at UBC. And in his seminal 2014 book, Red Skin, White Masks, he reminds us that, quote, a settler-colonial relationship is one characterized by a particular form of domination. That is, it's a relationship where power, in this case, interrelated discursive and non-discursive facets of economic, gendered, racial, and state power, has been structured into a relatively secure or sedimented set of hierarchical social relations that continue to facilitate the dispossession of Indigenous peoples of their lands and self-determining authority, end quote. And so I just spent the last 7.5 years living in Ottawa, and a lot of that time was spent very keenly observing how non-Indigenous parties were coming to understand the changes that are happening in the relationship between First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, and the Canadian state itself. And what I really learned in those years immediately following the national push for reconciliation in Canada that followed the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is that many settlers, particularly those in upper administrative and government roles in Canadian institutions, locate the problem of Indigenous erasure and dismissal of Indigenous environmental knowledges as a problem of a lack of inclusion of Indigenous peoples and worldviews in colonial institutions, such as universities, governments, and regulatory bodies. And this is partially true, but settler colonialism in this case is still imagined as a symbolic matter. And often the remedy that is given is that we just need to be kind and diversify our approaches. But going back to Glenn Coltard's work again, he shows us that, quote, in the Canadian context, colonial domination continues to be structurally committed to maintain, through force, fraud, and more recently, so-called negotiations, ongoing state access to the land and resources that contradictorily provide the material and spiritual sustenance of Indigenous societies on the one hand, and the foundation of colonial state formation, settlement, and capitalist development on the other, end quote. And I'm from Alberta, and this is so clear in Alberta, where we are a resource extractive province, and the provincial government itself is very hostile to really unpacking what it means to remove some of that control that the state and industries assert over Indigenous lands. And I want to be very clear here, I'm not speaking for any other Indigenous community. I can only speak as a Métis person. So, these are my thoughts, explicitly mine, and I take all blame for anything that I get wrong. So, in this space in Ottawa, studying how people were approaching these challenges of how to reconcile the fact that Canada is built on dispossession and displacement of Indigenous peoples, is that the settler colonial side of the equation is still really struggling with how to address the foundational violences that Canada is built on. And as the late anthropologist Patrick Wolfe argued, settler colonialism, which is the dominant social and political governance structure in Canada, is really built explicitly on trying to eliminate Indigenous peoples and replacing Indigenous peoples and governments with settler institutions. So I'm just going to skip ahead a little bit. The arguments that all of these critical Indigenous scholars, bring us to really drive home the fact that we have to really figure out how to truly materially change the relationships that are governing not just fish and water issues in the country, but the broader questions of land and displacement and dispossession. Glenn Coltard, Frantz Fanon, and others have really tried hard to bring us to acknowledging that. And this is the work that we're trying to do in our projects as well. So drawing on generations of critical decolonizing advocacy here and internationally, we're invited to pay attention to how colonial systems and governments still try to control the narrative, even when they claim to be reconciling or integrating Indigenous knowledge in good faith. And so here's one of my main takeaways, which is that Indigenous peoples really must be able to enter into fish and wildlife conservation negotiations from truly equal footing with settler Canada. In other words, when Indigenous law and sovereignty are centered, in all other aspects of community well-being follow, including environmental well-being. So long as Western colonial science and law are assumed to be the universal through which these relationships flow, and so long as academic, environmental, NGO, and regulatory institutions occupy unceded Indigenous lands without efforts to return lands and waters to full Indigenous governance, it's really difficult to build truly equitable or honorable freshwater fish conservation paradigms that will benefit all Canadians. And we really do all benefit when fish are thriving. We like to say in our projects that every part of Canada is a fish place. And it's really true. Every community has some kind of meaningful relationship to freshwater fish, and they have a lot to teach us about how to reimagine Canada as it is and can be. So our team's critical Indigenous fish philosophy work tends to these complex issues by asking how paying attention to fish, listening to fish, and working with stories with and about fish can help to build meaningful responses to Canada's failed management of stolen Indigenous lands, waters, and atmospheres historically and today. And I wanted to do this at the start of the talk, but I completely just bulldozed into the talk. But I want you to just take a moment because everyone here on the call and in the room, I know you have a waterway or a fish that really means something to you. And I think it's really good for us when we're talking about fish or thinking about how we want to build good relations with fish in this country, to give ourselves a moment to just sort of reflect on where is that place, or where are those relationships, or where is that particular fish? It could be an individual fish named Bob, or it could be a particular species of fish, like in my case, it's bull trout or northern pike, or I have a soft spot for minnows. But I just want you to take that moment to sort of maybe call them in if that feels right, or reflect on that place that drives you to do what you do. And just give yourself that moment to sort of think about how that place or that fish or that species makes you feel. What is it about that place that excites you, that draws you in, that makes you want to fight for it? Often in a lot of governance spaces, like settler governance spaces, we're not allowed to kind of soften into that. We're supposed to sort of present ourselves in a certain way and be very serious. And I've tried that. I'm not very good at it. I'm not a very serious person really at my core. But I know that, the thing that gets me up every day is just this thought that across this country, every single Indigenous nation has stories about fish, because fish are so foundational to every single governance system that has storied this place for millennia. And then last few hundred years of settler colonization, fish across the country almost uniformly have precipitously declined in one way or another. And to me, I can't think of, there's many different ways that we could mark resurgence, but the idea of really honoring those fishy relations and really doing the work and taking risks and doing things that maybe seem unorthodox or a bit out there or weird, but really taking those leaps and protecting those places, those fish, those relations, those, maybe they're your muses, but that's what drives us all. And that's, when I'm working with scientists, I love working with scientists because you love fish. You don't go to work every day to study fish if you don't love them, if you're not fascinated by them, if you don't, to use sort of internet language, if you don't think they're kind of weird little guys that have a lot to teach us. And I really have found in our kind of last few years of sort of meetings and collaborations that we're building between community partners and scientists and others, something that keeps bringing everyone to the table and talking and excited is that we all love fish for different reasons. And all of us have somehow been drawn into that world, whether it was, some of us were drawn into that world by having a parent who was a fisheries biologist and just made that world come alive for us. And my Métis dad made that world come alive for us by telling us fish stories and stories about, growing up in Alberta and what the waterways were like when he was little. And so there is a heaviness to this work in that we have to dismantle the harm that settler colonization has done to place, to people, to communities, to laws, to Indigenous sovereignty. But I also think that we have these very charismatic things that are drawing us into that work and that actually genuinely keep us going. And for me, it's fish. For some other people, maybe it's plants or rocks. Maybe you just really love rocks. But these are really, this is kind of what drives our work. We, on the one hand, are very critical of the state. I'm unapologetically critical of Canada. Someday, if not on this recorded talk, we could talk elsewhere about some of the creative ways that the state finds to let you know it's watching you when you're critical of it as an Indigenous scholar. But but then there's this other side to it, which is that people are really passionate about the places that we live, and maybe even more so in the last few years, I think a lot of us have really come to realize that all we have are our relations. All we have is how we treat one another. And we have to really significantly change what that looks on a broader scale in Canada, because Black, Indigenous, racialized, refugee, and other displaced and dispossessed peoples are not being treated well by the current order of things. So I'm going to now shift tone a little bit and give you an explicit example of how some of these relationships can actually play out in a really powerful way and in a hopeful way in the first example that I'm going to provide. And this is an example, this is one of those sort of things that I got to learn about. I was so privileged to learn about from knowledge keepers in the community of Paulatuk and about how they're applying their laws to protect fish. And it's, again, one of those things that keeps me getting up in the morning, knowing that people in Paulatuk have been able to apply their laws to protect fish. And so I'm just going to talk about Charno, which is another species that I'm quite passionate about because they're just really neat little guys. So we're actually here and we're ready. I've had the Paulatuk slide up for a very long time, but we're actually here. We got here on the road. So in 2010 to 2016, I did my PhD at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland, and I had the opportunity to work with fishermen and community leaders in the Nunavut community of Paulatuk. And I'm just going to show you. We're going to talk about char in the community of Paulatuk in the Western Arctic. And a commercial fishery was designated on the Hornaday River in Paulatuk in 1968. And this was a socioeconomic development project that was implemented by government bodies without doing the baseline data study that was recommended by the consultants, Gunther Abrahamson and Peter Usher, who had recommended a commercial fishery as a potential socioeconomic project in a 1963 report to the federal government that they did in the region. This was a response to the fact that the whaling economy and the fur trade economy had collapsed recently in the region, and there were concerns that people in the region wouldn't have a way to make money. So this is one of the sort of remedies that consultants provided to the federal government. But as this commercial fishery was implemented in the community, people quickly realized that the fish were not doing okay. And so as community members shared with me during my PhD, efforts to get the federal government to address the community's concerns during this period was unsatisfactory. However, Paulatuk were undaunted by this, and as federal interest in resource extraction heated up in the region in the 1970s, leaders from Paulatuk played a very central role in the negotiation of the Inuvialuit Comprehensive Land Claim. By 1984, when the land claim was finalized, community leaders were able to quickly mobilize the wildlife and fisheries management mechanisms and committees established in the land claim to work with scientists to determine the health of the Hornaday River char. Within 2 years, so by 1986, they had corroborated local knowledge about the status of the fish populations in the river with data collected by scientists working for the community, which is to say the scientific data confirmed exactly what local knowledge keepers had asserted since the late 1960s. The commercial fishery was having an impact on the status of Hornaday River char and an impact on the community. The commercial fishery was closed by 1987, and a community-based management and monitoring program has been in place ever since. Significant in this is the central role that Inuvialuit law played in the governance of the char decline in the region. And the outcomes for the fish under this governance model have been much more robust than in other places. The community has been able to maintain an annual harvest of 1,700 char from this river, which was increased to 1,800 in 2013, which meets a significant portion of the community's needs across the hamlet. While the Hornaday River char were listed as sensitive in the NWT's 2006 species rankings, Arctic char and the NWT are presently considered secure under the general status ranks of wild species in the territory. And the Hornaday River char were assessed by the Department of Fisheries and Oceans in 2016 to be healthy. So it's an incredible turnaround to go from, being a fishery in concern to now being healthy within 30 years. The success story speaks to the power of local Inuvialuit governance and politic and the incredible visionary work that local Inuvialuit fishermen have done to shift federal and territorial understandings of how to properly care for fish as more than human beings and to assert Inuvialuit law in the governance of environmental, fisheries, and wildlife matters. So, by contrast, in Alberta, we see a very different outcome for a different char. So Salvelinus alpinus is Arctic char. And in Alberta, we have Salvelinus confluentus, bull trout. So in the 1960s, when still a young man, my late stepdad Wayne began his own investigations into the status of bull trout in the waterways that he grew up in central Alberta, namely around the Red Deer River and its environs. By talking with fishermen and conducting his own interviews with locals, who could recall the relative status of the species all the way back to the early 1900s, he became alarmed by how rapidly and significantly the species had declined throughout waterways it had once occupied. And some argue that the species used to inhabit stretches of the North Saskatchewan River well into the prairies, even down to Edmonton. Other naturalists and biologists like Lauren Fitch and other prominent fisheries biologists in the province also share their recollections of much more abundant and hardy bull trout populations when they were growing up in the province, a phenomenon that someone born in the 80s like me can hardly imagine. And given the state of the fish's populations now in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. So my colleague Lorelei Hansen has traced a social scientific history of bull trout conservation in Alberta and demonstrates that part of the reason bull trout are in so much trouble today is that when settlers arrived in the province, they deemed bull trout a garbage fish. And the introduction of trout that settlers deemed superior fishing quarry, including brown trout, Salmo truta, and brook trout, Salvelinus fontinalis, was encouraged. By the 1960s, it was becoming clear that these colonial choices were having a big impact on bull trout. In 1982, the Alberta Fish and Wildlife Association met in Edmonton for their annual gathering. That year, Wayne presented a resolution at the meeting that was tabled as a resolution to help the bull trout. The resolution was passed and efforts were made by a consortium of conservation groups, including Trout Unlimited, the Federation of Alberta Naturalists, the Edmonton Trout Club, and the Alberta Fish and Game Association to advocate for the province of Alberta to take action. This helped to spur government action, and by 1985, Alberta Environment and Natural Resources had produced a bull trout management plan, and subsequent steps were taken in the form of task forces, conferences, and ongoing efforts to compile data on the state of bull trout population distribution and size. But in the 39 years since the Alberta Fish and Wildlife Association passed their Help the Bull Trout resolution, bull trout populations along the eastern slopes have declined significantly and much further. They were listed as a species of significant concern under the Alberta Wildlife Act in 2002, deemed as threatened by COSOIC in 2012, and listed as threatened under the Species at Risk Act in 2019, a year after Wayne passed away. CBC reported in 2019 that, quote, populations have declined between 30 and 50% over the last 25 years, according to then co-chair of the COSOIC Freshwater Fishes Specialist Committee, John Post. While it is not possible to make a direct comparison in conservation outcomes between the two different homelands and habitats that these char occupy in northern and southern Canada, it is fair to note that one significant differentiating factor in the outcomes for these two different char populations is that Indigenous legal orders are considered differently and treated differently in Alberta governance, where numbered treaties 6, 7, and 8 are in place, and provincial and federal governments have very different consultation and planning frameworks under this jurisdiction. which I argue makes Alberta and the federal bodies implicated in bull trout habitat orders less responsive to Indigenous legal orders in their governance of species at risk and environmental impacts in Alberta. Given the different legal frameworks at play, we can see the significant difference in outcomes there are for char in northern Canada and bull trout in southern Canada. So our projects seek to intervene in these kinds of jurisdictional oversights and quandaries, and we argue that the number one way to overhaul and shift problems with how species at risk policies are applied to freshwater fish is to reimagine species at risk governance through plural Indigenous legal orders and concrete and fulsome land back initiatives, which would bring Canada into better reciprocal responsibilities through Canada's duties to Indigenous nations over the hundreds of years of treaties and ongoing land claims negotiations that Canada is party to. So this is just sort of a brief history of that long slog to try and protect the fish. And in this approach, Indigenous law is not centered. Indigenous communities and nations are treated as stakeholders, no different from industry or environmental NGOs. And my argument and the basis of some of our ongoing work is that the problem here is that the provinces like Alberta, like Saskatchewan, really do not understand their ongoing responsibility to honor Indigenous sovereignty. And this is having a massive outcome for species at risk. So I think I'll just sort of end here by sort of gesturing to the fact that we're really stuck in a situation where Canada as a state firmly sees itself as the authority through which to govern questions of species declines. But we have the reality that Canada is it is a nation that is built upon the lands of many, many, many nations that have been here far longer and have treated fish very differently than Canada does. And I want to also open this up to thinking trans-regionally as well. It's important to think of reconciliation, not just in terms of how Indigenous peoples in Canada reconcile to the nation state of Canada, which is really asking us to reconcile with, the Crown that is itself implicated in violations against local and Indigenous peoples in many places, in Nigeria, in Kenya, in India, Malaysia, all of these places where very, very violent things were done in the name of the Crown. And I want us to sort of flip that thinking on its head and ask, what if our reconciliation, what if our solidarity was not necessarily reconciling ourselves to the Crown or to the nation state, but was actually in reconciling the responsibilities we have with other displaced, dispossessed, and diasporic peoples globally. And this is where some of our international fish work comes in. And so I want to end with sort of a gesture to my very dear friend and colleague, Nadine King-Chambers, who does brilliant work thinking trans-regionally. She looks at the impacts of bauxite, which is ored in Jamaica, and is actually processed in Kitimat in northern BC. And she thinks through the solidarities, but also the distinct experiences of Black and Indigenous peoples in colonial contexts like Canada and the Caribbean. And so she draws on the thinking of Paul Gilroy to remind us that, quote, I contemplate the spaces between Black and Indigenous peoples' parallel and interesting histories of displacement, migration, and decolonial struggles. My focus is on the traces of contested and still largely unwritten relationships as key to current discussions about Black freedom and Indigenous sovereignty, end quote. And so a lot of the work that we're trying to do is really that thinking through these still largely unwritten relationships, and how can we materially shift whose stories are told. And so in the question period, what I can do is sort of show you some of these projects that we're doing that allow us to get those sort of still unwritten histories fleshed out into tangible projects. They've been funded. They're not, just imaginary. They are real projects that we're doing with amazing community partners. We have all sorts of things forthcoming. Our website's going to be up soon for the Restoring bull trout project. We have a podcast, The Bull Trout Show, coming online soon. We're working with community partners in Southern Alberta to set up a museum exhibit in Sundre in the Eastern Slopes that's going to explore sort of the history of bull trout and the passion that people have about bull trout. And mainly we're just really interested in the stories that people tell about fish. And in the question period, I can also tell you about sort of my more experimental work, like imagining trouties in place of treaties, which is sort of like a speculative artistic approach to imagining what the fish would negotiate between themselves. So imagining like what would invasive trout, and Indigenous trout have to say to one another as they sort of negotiate the situations that humans, colonial parties have put them in the waterways of the Rockies in Alberta. And then there's also the work that I'm doing with my very dear friend and colleague, Amr Khangeest, around listening. We do these workshops that you're definitely welcome to join if you're interested in them, where we really ask, how do we listen to place? How do we listen and work thoughtfully in places that we find ourselves? And then some of the other work that we're doing is just sort of speculative play. I'm working with Kaylin Pybus, who is developing sort of an experimental video that's going to sort of video game that's going to go up on our website as well. And then also just sort of like documenting the things that fish are experiencing in Alberta. So some of you might know this as a gesture to the very famous news story that the late David Schindler was a part of, where they collected and demonstrated the impacts that the Alberta oil sands were having on whitefish in northern rivers. And I think I'll end with a minnow, which are my favorite, one of my absolute favorite freshwater fish, because they're small but mighty and a little bit, dogged underdog. Everybody's always chasing them, but they're really significantly important to the waterways that they're part of. And when I was a little girl growing up, I used to just watch the minnows for hours at the cabin that my mom's family has in north central Alberta. So this is the way that we do the work that we do. And just a final thought is I take very seriously the guidance of my friend, Joanna Radin, who says that her job is to liberate the ill-gotten funds of the colonial institutions and get it to the people who are doing work on the ground. And the thing that really drives our research and our experimental work and our artistic work and our knowledge mobilization is the idea that we have a responsibility to make sure that the funding gets to the people on the ground who are already doing this key land and water and fish protection work. Communities have so many things that need funding, and our job we see our job as making sure that funding gets to the people who are already doing the work, and making ourselves as useful as possible in that process. So Ginanas Komitin, thank you so much for listening. I hope that was at least a little bit coherent. I'm definitely grateful I could still join you, even though I've caught one of the various viruses circulating in Vancouver right now. And I really look forward to our question period. So thank you so much.
We should have an ability to take questions both online and also in the room, and I'll be passing you the mic should you have a question.
Hi again, Zoe, it's Andrea. I just really want to start by thanking you for sharing in this way and being with us here tonight in the ways that you're able to. I feel like those last slides have shown us a lot of what's to come, which I'm so excited to learn more about. And hearing you mention, a video game, a podcast, and seeing some of your works, it's so exciting to see that come together. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to what role do those modes of communication have in our work? Why is that so central to the work that you're undertaking at SFU and with all of these great colleagues you just mentioned? Thank you.
Thanks, Andrea. Yeah. So I was raised by a journalist and an artist and a fisheries biologist. And what really stands out for me being immersed in that very eclectic world is the power of stories is very important. And scientists are storytellers. And my mom was an environmental and science journalist for several decades. And what always stood out for me was that she could go into any lab in, Edmonton or Calgary or Red Deer and get a scientist to tell a story about what they were doing. And it's really exciting because scientists are themselves very excited about what they're doing. And we really want to continue to encourage that kind of curiosity and excitement, but also bring other communities into the conversation about what fish science can look like in Alberta. And growing up in Alberta and having a lot of my academic commitments still grounded there, Alberta is a very politically polarized space. It always has been. And what we've learned very quickly is that fish are one of these just really incredible sort of space or like set of relations that people can relate to across political divides. And so in Alberta, it can be very dangerous, career limiting, very unsafe to openly critique things that are harming the environment in Alberta. But you can find really creative ways to invite people into envisioning futures together. If you ask people to start talking about what the fish mean to them in the province. And I've talked about this in other talks. When the province changed its approach to governance of the sort of mining regulations in the Eastern Slopes last year, one of the things that really emerged was people across the entire political spectrum were uniting around fish and water. And you had musicians like Corblund and Paul Brandt, all sort of saying like we have standing up for the fish. And that's sort of the spirit of what we're trying to carry forward, is that fish are just these incredible kind of, I don't know, they're these kind of inspirational weird little guys that people really feel passionately about, whether you're relying on them for sustenance, for food, for ceremony, or you're a recreational fisherman who does catch and release, or you just really appreciate the work that they do to keep waterways healthy. We found that almost everyone has a fish story, and that's what we're trying to kind of really draw out and celebrate. And it's really enabled us to connect with really diverse parties, and we're really excited. We're just starting, so we're really excited where this is going to go, and where other people are taking it too. We sort of think of the work we're doing as kind of a toolkit that other communities can adapt as needed, and leave what we're doing that doesn't work for you, but take what does, and apply it as you'd like. And that's kind of our goal too, is to just encourage people to tell stories about fish in ways that help us to protect them.
My name is Sarah. I'm an undergraduate student at UBC studying animal welfare, and something that you said a while, or kind of maybe midway through, talking about how or kind of the challenges that happen when we try to just as kind of include Indigenous peoples in already European or kind of like Western structures when talking about fish welfare specifically. But something that kind of brought to mind is in my welfare classes, a lot of the work that we talk about is getting Indigenous perspective and how important that is, which you echoed. However, it's still currently taught, like last week in this room, we were talking about assimilating and getting Indigenous perspectives, but on still Western committees. So, and with your perspective in an ideal world, how would you see going about, and you can either speak about specifically fish or just general animal welfare.
That's a great question. Yeah. And, it's one that I think lots of people are dedicating their time to trying and answer. And so I can only offer you the little bit that I know. But, thinking about living on Vancouver Island, I live in a place that was settled in the early 1900s, and settlers there feel very passionate about the town that they live in. But they couldn't tell you whose nation their lands are on. And when I came from Ottawa, that just blew my mind. I was like, how do you not know who's, and I said, I'm going to make sure I know whose lands we're on. And I think that it really underscores, it's also an area that's hoping to incorporate, and they talk about self-governance. And I'm sort of sitting there and I'm like, okay, yes, but also you're on Coast Salish lands. And I think it's that kind of working towards that fundamental shift in helping people who are occupying lands through settler colonization to really understand that like a truly like equal approach or a justice oriented approach would shift us out of that idea that we just need to kind of get Indigenous perspectives on, the colonial perspective, but that we actually have to fundamentally change how we understand why we're here, whose governance systems have informed and storied the places that we are. And then that other piece that I think is we're still struggling to kind of articulate in Canada is, settler colonization itself is a very complicated structure. And there's a difference between Euro-colonial parties who have benefited from white supremacy and colonialism and other forces, and then displaced and dispossessed and diasporic peoples from other parts of the world who are living here precisely because the same colonial forces have forced people out of their homelands elsewhere. And there's that kind of unpacking we still need to do. And that's, sort of why I wanted to end with Nadine's work thinking across the Caribbean and Northern British Columbia. In an ideal world, we would be able to put that all on the table and say, we're in a place that has been inextricably shaped by the last 600 years of very powerful, unprecedented things that have happened on the planet. But what do we collectively need so that we can all collectively be here in a way that really acknowledges the responsibilities we have to the lands, waters, atmospheres, more than human beings, but also incorporates the laws of this place as they have existed for millennia. And how do we also make space for displaced Indigenous peoples from Africa, from other parts of the global South? How do we think across those experiences? So that's not a very quick answer. It's not an easy answer, and it might not be the answer that can you can kind of concretely take and say, okay, here's our guidance. But for me, and Amr and I are working on a book right now about listening, and fundamentally we're realizing it's about integrity. Are we coming to those conversations with integrity as the various different groups of people? And it's one of the reasons as a Métis person, I remind Métis folks, we might live in BC, but we are in sovereign First Nations lands, and we have to come to that with integrity. And so that's one of the ways I'm trying to honor it, is to remember that sort of integrity approach.
Okay, I might ask one last question. Is there anything online? Okay, so it's enterprise. Just, I'm very conscious here in BC the importance of marine fish to the Indigenous people, but I've never given much thought to the importance of freshwater fish. And maybe my bias to living too close to salt water. Give me some sense from the prairies and like Arctic char and bull trout. What role do they play in the lives of Indigenous people from the prairies?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we're working with Stoney Nakoda elders who are teaching us the importance that different Indigenous species have had for the community over a very long time, and the impact of the decline of those species so quickly over the last, really in Alberta, it's been just over 100 years that species like West Slope cutthroat trout, Athabasca rainbow trout, and bull trout have started to decline so rapidly. And it has an impact both in terms of being able to access a form of food that people relied on for a very long time, a very reliable form of food. An elder that I was lucky to work with in Paulatuk reminded me throughout my time in the community that you never go hungry in the land if you have fish. And so, I think there's a very, very good and important focus on marine species precisely because they have been the sort of backbone of a lot of Indigenous sort of like lives for a very long time. But it's actually not that different on the prairies either. Fish have been an important source of food, but also important for ceremony and also the stories that people tell about place and ways of understanding place. So yeah, and also, there's things that I can't talk about that I don't have permission to share in terms of sort of that more spiritual or ceremonial aspect that fish play. But, we're really proud that when we start our projects, before we even go and get ethics approval from the university, the first thing we do is the elders ask us to do ceremony. And that's to us, permission from the fish to even do work with them. And that's sort of some of the, the direction our work is going as well, is sort of, I know that when I was doing my biology undergrad, no one was saying like, should we ask permission from fish to study them? But that's, one of these components that Indigenous approaches is bringing into the conversation. And I think it's really exciting.
Thank you so much. I'd like to call on Dr. William Charno to say a few words of thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the talk. On behalf of the IOF, I want to express our sincere gratitude to you. Thank you, particularly for giving this amazing lecture, even when you are not feeling very well. I hope you will have a speedy and well recovery. One of the uniqueness of the Larkin Lecture series is that it allows us to hear diverse perspectives and knowledge and way of knowing, expanding our mind and thinking and challenging our point of view. I have felt that very strongly that through your lectures, I feel strongly that it's achieving this objective. I feel like I had enjoyed a really delightful and feeling meal for my mind and soul. With that, I want to make my remark by making a quote from one of Zoe's your essays published in the Center for Humans and Nature series, Home Story, What Story Does the Land Hold? The essay is embedded in a story about her road trip, road journey to returning to Alberta from Ottawa, traveling through the Asian Sea of Western Interior. Zoe wrote, "My return to the lingering expanses of the Western Interior series last year opened an invitation to drill on Ghost Keeper's point about making a living with the land versus making a living from the land. Elmer Ghost Keepers was who Zoe referred to in the essay is a mighty thinker. I think the land that Zoe mentioned in her essay and the code had extended to include the freshwater and ocean systems on and around the land. And this relates really closely to what all of us, the IOF and Zoe, is working towards to find a way to live with the environment, with the ocean and with the water, instead of living from there. And Zoe is sharing a very unique and very valuable perspective from her point of view and from a way of knowing. So we really appreciate that. And with that, I also want to thank the Larkin family, particularly Jim Larkin, for their support to the Larkin Lecture series as well. I would like to also thank the Larkin Lecture Organizing Committee for their wonderful work to make these lectures series happen. The committee members again include Andrew Trout, Pamela Rosenberg, Catherine Kane, Dan Palamaris, Dan Foley, and Julia Elsmer. I also want to thank Andrea for the help and support, as well as other colleagues, staff, and students for all their contribution to this event. So thank you again, Zoe. I really look forward to the many opportunities for us to see each other, maybe in person, as well as virtual, and to have many more conversations and maybe even collaboration. Thank you very much.